You're listening to Pastor, the podcast dedicated to pastors, church planners, and church revitalizers. Hi, I'm your host, Rob Trubia, and with me as always is Wes Pastor, president of the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization. In today's episode, Wes talks about leading with courage and clarity. All right, let's get started. Wes, thanks for coming back for another episode. These podcasts are really hard to do if you don't show up.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Rob.
You know, there's another podcast out there that I really enjoy listening to, From Dan to Beersheba from Christ Memorial Church. And I'm a big fan of it. I love listening to it. And you know, something caught me by surprise. You were on that podcast a couple of months ago, I think it was, and you mentioned that in the early years of Christ Memorial Church, say like 1992 to maybe like 1999, those first 7 years, you were baptizing people pretty indiscriminately. Can you explain what you mean by that, and what did that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the word indiscriminate may not tell the story very well, so maybe it was a poor choice of words. We weren't baptizing indiscriminately in the sense that we weren't vetting the baptismal candidates, but we were mainly baptizing people's kids, including my own. And of course, they could all articulate the gospel, and they all said they believed the gospel, but by and large, they were elementary-aged kids. Of course, the parents would have been supportive. What I'm saying is that we really weren't very clear about what marks true faith. We weren't thinking in those terms, and it's hard with little kids anyways. Even if you've got, Jonathan Edwards' religious affections clarity, how do you apply that to a third grader? So what I mean is that we really just didn't have any category for how do we know that they truly believe? How do we know that this isn't just mental assent? This isn't just kids wanting to do what they think their parents want them to do. And little kids who actually think, yeah, that's what they believe. They're in church, their parents believe that, they believe that. That's kind of how families work. So we learned after the fact that the vast majority of those kids had not come to Christ. And that's hardcore fact. We were able to see that because they grew up and they rejected Christ in their teenage years. So discriminately, I mean by that, we're actually looking for signs of faith and trying to see, has this thing really taken root in their hearts, or is it just an ideology that they're ascribing to?
Okay, so about 7 years would be enough time to start seeing some 7-year-olds turn to 14-year-olds.
That's right.
10 years old to 17 years old.
That's right. I'm not criticizing anybody or anything. It did lead to us a policy where we would be hesitant to baptize elementary school age kids, not because we don't think they can come to Christ. I've got probably 2 kids that I'm fairly sure came to Christ, maybe 3 in those early years, but just because it's hard to discriminate. And so now you have to decide what's your criteria for baptism, which is a whole nother question. It's probably a whole nother podcast.
It is.
But that scenario rose to the top of the charts for us because we saw such a huge number, well over 90%. I charted it. Well over 90% of these kids did not truly come to faith when we baptized them.
So in those early years, elders start to see that. They start to tweak things a little bit. Any pushback from parents?
A little bit, but they saw the same phenomena. And so it was generally no problem because we link communion, the Lord's table, to baptism. That was probably the main area of pushback, because if a parent thinks their child's really come to faith, and again, easily they could have, we would ask them to hold off until we baptized them. And we didn't start baptizing after that experience until middle school at the earliest, but we were most comfortable with high school. Middle school, case by case. And so that meant they weren't taking communion till that time. And sometimes the parents were a little uncomfortable with that. They thought they should be able to take communion. And I understand that. I understand that's how they felt. But the elders were fairly strong in believing, yeah, that's just a little bit of a collateral damage from what we think is a better policy.
If you, even in those early years, if not maybe once it's got going 5 or 10 years later, or 5 or 10 years into the life of Christ Memorial Church, if you observed 5, 6, 7-year-olds taking communion with their family, would you say something to them or just let it go? How do you handle that?
Yeah, you mean after the policy
after
was
the
in
policy
place?
And it's just something you started to see 2, 3 Sundays in a row?
Yeah, we would very discreetly see if we could just chat about that. And we never had parents get, defiant or upset. I mean, maybe a little disappointed. But I think when you're consistent with whatever policy you have, people are pretty respectful of that. And we were trying to say, look, if you do it, then how do we enforce the policy over here? Let's review why we have this policy. And I found the parents very reasonable on the whole process.
And was it the same policy if it was a 20 or 30-year-old?
It was the same policy for a 20 or 30-year-old that if they had not been baptized, we asked them not to partake with communion. And if we saw that they were disregarding that, we would speak to them on that and encourage them. What's keeping you from getting baptized? Here's the water. Let's be baptized. And 9.5 out of 10 cases, they would do it. So really did not cause any kind of ruckus.
Did you also have, I don't think it'd probably be a policy, but I'm just curious of your line of thinking and how the elders would think it through, that someone would say that I've become a Christian, I believe. You baptize them next week?
Yeah, no. And there's a practice out there right now, Rob, you may have heard of it. It's termed spontaneous baptisms. So a church will have a baptismal service and invite anybody who has not been baptized that has believed to come up. I think that's irresponsible shepherding. I think that, the church has the keys, and a proper use of those keys is the guarding of the sacraments. We call it fencing the table when we talk about the Lord's table. But just in general, we have somebody that is professing faith. Well, let's at least interact with them, an adult. Let's interact with them. Let's see if they even know what they're talking about. You can't do that with the spontaneous baptism. So someone says they want to be baptized. Well, maybe in the next month or two, because you've had a chance to talk to them, make sure you know who they are. And I think that's just responsible shepherding. The last thing we want to do is give somebody a false assurance. With so many examples of devil faith, where people have professed based on some other criteria other than the Spirit of God actually moving in their hearts and creating faith in them, the faith that saves. It's just helpful to them to make sure they're discriminating between, I had an emotional moment and God's really gotten a hold of me. Those are two very different things.
I'm curious if you ever get any pushback on that. Maybe somebody points to the Ethiopian eunuch. Hey, there it is. He came to faith. He's been baptized immediately.
Yeah.
Does it matter that it's a different generation, much different generation? Does it matter? Does context matter with the society that you're in?
Yeah, I think context matters a lot. In our society, there's virtually no cost to come into faith. In the New Testament context, there was a big cost to come into faith. Maybe the best scenario is to think of a Muslim context. Someone comes to faith in that context, there's a high price to be paid. So that makes it more difficult to know the genuineness of a profession, because there really is no cost. In some cases, it's actually a benefit. It's an asset. And so I think the context makes all the difference in the world. So you can't just flatly say, well, 3,000 Jews got baptized on the day of Pentecost. Yeah, and they were immediately out of sync with their culture. They were immediately out of sync with their religious environment. Not so today. We live in a pretty much live and let live kind of mindset. And as long as you're not pushing your ideas on somebody else, people kind of don't care. In America, it's the definition of pluralism. So I think you can't take the Bible and just flatly apply it like that. You've got to recognize the Bible was written in a certain time. We don't wash one another's feet. Well, why? Because we wear shoes and we have sidewalks and paved roads. So, when Jesus says, I washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Well, we understand it's a gesture of servanthood. Well, we ought to serve one another, but that particular application is culturally irrelevant to us today.
So there's not a big risk there. There's no risk, really. It's almost like you said, a benefit, especially if they're younger in a family that mom and dad are excited.
Yeah, they get all kinds of family kudos from that, and not necessarily so in that context. So you've gone against the Jewish religion in that context. There could be serious consequences.
So it's a little bit of we're excited with you, but let's just pump the brakes a little bit and let's just see if this thing is real.
Yeah, and we're not trying to discourage parents in the least. We're not saying you shouldn't treat them as if they've come to faith, but you're also saying, let's just see what really happens, because things can come and go pretty quickly with kids. They can get excited. I mean, just notice whatever you're buying at Christmas time. It changes from year to year. They're not excited about that this year. They were super excited about that last year. You don't want Jesus to be in that kind of category. So a little time, a little marinating helps to really see what do I have here? Because right now they're under my tutelage. It's difficult to get an independent read.
This podcast is for pastors. That's what this podcast is about. Wes, what would you tell pastors that are listening that go, that sounds a little bit uncomfortable to engage with adults that might want to be baptized right away, and you're telling them, let's wait a little bit, let's talk it through, and especially with parents, how do you encourage them? What do you tell them? How do they approach that if that's not really been what they've been doing?
I think when people are parishioners, when they are convinced that we love them and that we're not trying to block their goals, we're really trying to facilitate their goals, but perhaps add a nuance to their thinking that they don't have. When people are sure you're for them and they're sure that your desire is to care for them, I find that even if they end up disagreeing, it's not in a relationally tearing kind of way. It's in a respectful, even deep respectful kind of way, because they know you love them. And now they're making some decisions about respecting your leadership and your shepherding, and that's part of the process. How did they learn to do that? Well, they see, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe this person has some wisdom that I just wasn't giving them credit for. And you just go through life with them like that.
So it's about just them knowing that you're coming from a place of love.
A place of love, and maybe a place of understanding the nuances of Scripture that are maybe not so plain on the surface. And trusting you, therefore, as a handler of God's word and a shepherd that is committed to caring for the sheep.
In a pastoral context, do you think leadership starts with real love for your people?
I think it does. I mean, think about parenting, Rob. I've got 5 kids. They're all grown kids. And I think they would tell you to a person that whenever they were hesitant in their assessment that I really loved them, it caused tension. And it's actually more pointed than that. They needed to know that I liked them. And, kids are all different, and parents have different levels of like and dislike. They love all their kids, but sometimes it's harder to like certain kids, just different personalities. And, I had to work that muscle because I have my likes, my dislikes, and usually it relates to whether they're like me or not, which is so self-centered. But when they knew that I liked them, they could smooth over the rough places a lot easier in terms of what one professor used to call my ix-asms, our ix-asms and spasms. They'd smooth over those. When parishioners are not sure that you like them, if they think you're coming at them from a position of frustration, irritation, whatever, their openness to what you have to say diminishes quickly. And I think you're working hard to make it clear, I'm for you, I like you, this is just a concern. And I'm voicing this concern because faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Better is open rebuke than love concealed, Solomon said. So I love you. I'm willing to say something that might have a little edge to it, but it's because I think it would be helpful.
I think one of the things that I've seen with you, and I've heard you talk about too, is just leading with courage. And I heard you say recently, courage plus clarity is real leadership. I wondered if you would just talk about that for a little bit.
We go to seminary, and I am a huge fan of seminary. I believe in it. I think it is a critical component of preparation for the ministry, because it's hard to do all the stuff that seminary has you do on your own. But the general result of seminary is an enhanced clarity about theology, about the Bible, about the role of a minister, all of that, check, 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 check. You have to add to that the courage to do that which could produce rejection. And I think a lot of times men go into the ministry thinking this is just going to be great. People are going to appreciate that I'm here to be helpful. They're going to appreciate my learning and be respectful of that. And you get into the ministry and you find out, well, yeah, to some extent. I think I was the most shocked at CMC when I planted it to find out and to see that an awful lot of the people really didn't care that I'd been to seminary. And there wasn't even a special category given for, well, he might know more than I do about this. It was kind of like the playing field was absolutely level. And in fact, if I tried to posture myself that way, it was like, well, who does this guy think he is? Mr. Know-it-all? Well, no, not Mr. Know-it-all. I just think I know more than you do. That's a little bit of a snarky answer. But I think when you start proclaiming the truth of the gospel, it's going to ruffle feathers. And it can seem counterintuitive if you're trying to grow a church, or as I was trying to do, plant a church. That seems a little counterintuitive to success.
Yeah, it sure does.
And your livelihood's dependent on this. So now the stakes are pretty high. You got 5 little kids looking at you while you're going around potentially offending the ones that are paying your salary. So you gotta come to terms with the fact that you are there to minister the truth, which doesn't mean you do it without shrewdness, without interpersonal savvy, without gentleness and care and all the things that the Bible admonishes with tenderness. But Jesus said the truth very tenderly, and he got crucified. Jesus communicated perfectly, and he got crucified. So there's no way that we're going to be able to circumvent that kind of treatment. So we bring the clarity. We need the clarity because otherwise we got heat without light, and that's not helpful. We need the courage because otherwise we got light without heat. We need the passion. People need to know that you believe what you're saying and that you're willing to take a hit for it. People actually respect that when they see you're willing to put yourself out there and say, this is what I believe. This is more importantly what I think the Bible believes, and I'm going to declare it, whatever the cost. I'm losing my life for Christ's sake and for the gospel's sake. So both of those have to be in play. They both have to be there.
Yeah, and I don't think that's something, and this isn't a knock at all on seminary, but that's not what seminary is about. Seminary is not about learning those nuances and how to be courageous with that. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think seminary is great at the clarity side, but it's mostly an illuminating kind of preparation. You know, our residency program, and now we're learning with our new internship program, they're seeing the transition from the theoretical to the practical, and the practical is all about courage. You don't have to be courageous to do well in seminary. You have to know how to listen, do the assignments, in some cases be really quite accomplished academically. You don't have to be courageous. You have to be courageous in the pastorate. And so you can't really learn that in seminary.
It sounds like it's hard to find an example of a great leader who doesn't possess great courage.
Well, that's right. That's right. And usually has paid a price for it. If you look down through the annals of history, whether it's in the church or just in secular history, there's usually pain associated with that courage.
And do you think leadership is a critical component to being an effective pastor?
I do. I mean, the pastor has to cast vision. He has to mobilize his congregation to do things that are counterintuitive. It is counterintuitive to proclaim a message when the very one who has given us that message and who is the message, the Lord Jesus Christ, said, "The world hated me because I testify against it that its deeds are evil." And a slave is not greater than his master. If they hated me, they're going to hate you. So, yeah, go out there and proclaim this message, which Jesus said will produce the world's hate. Yeah, I think that it's courage that does that, and I think leadership enables you to maintain that courageous stance because you recognize that people need someone to lead them. Sheep, shepherd, those are all vivid metaphors in the Bible to communicate what's needed. And I think parishioners can get nervous, they can get scared, they can get back on their heels, society can intimidate them. And for courageous leadership, the plurality of the leaders, we call them elders, to stand firm and say, nope, we're moving forward. We're not going to let Y2K intimidate us. We're not going to get back in a holy huddle because the government seems a little squishy. We're not going to allow what seems to be just a tumultuous society in general. I think of our brothers in Cameroon, Rob, and they've gone through this sort of under-the-radar civil war. And these brothers are continuing to plant churches. I recently had one of the pastors, Pastor Shadrach, this was about a year or two ago, say that every day his wife drives to work, she teaches at the school that's on the compound of the Cameroon Baptist Convention, which is safe. But to get there, she says every day there's gunshots, there's bullets. Reverend Shadrach is praying that she would not get shot. And he's planting churches. She's going to work, she's planting churches. It's hard to do that when it doesn't seem safe. And I think if a leader is not saying, our safety is not in these things, our safety is in the Lord, and he's commanded us to do this, and we need to follow. He wants us to take that hill. Yep, some of us probably will get shot, figuratively speaking, but he's told us that he wants us to take that hill. Let's ask God to give us the strength and the courage to do that. Someone's got to be saying that, because otherwise what will we do? We'll get in a holy huddle, we'll turn inward, and we'll say, be careful, it's scary out there. No. We're on the offensive. We're taking the offense, and we're trying to move the kingdom forward. So yeah, I think it's critical. Without it, sermons become information transfer that is designed just to make the parishioners feel better. And they will, but it falls way short of what they're supposed to do.
Well, then let me ask you, Wes, how does a pastor keep his parishioners on the offensive? What do you think the right biblical perspective is?
You know, I've been thinking recently, just as I get older, I've been thinking about death more than normal. And a lot of the people around me, they're either dying or they've had brushes with death through significant illness. And I thought, what is it that makes death so intimidating and so difficult to face? And I think one of the reasons is that we don't follow the apostle's prescription when he says, I die daily. See, what was it with the apostle Paul that seems to not knocked him off course when he was in that prison and he wrote his swan song in 2 Timothy? I fought the good fight, I've run the race, I've finished the course. I mean, he just seems like he's in an exaltation mode. You know, the Lord will deliver me safely into his heavenly kingdom, he says at the end of 2 Timothy 4. I think death had already occurred. He'd already died. In his mind, he understood that life as a Christian is a living death. And that could sound morbid, but I think that it enables us to not be holding on. And so, yeah, let's plant churches when there's sort of this under-the-radar civil war going on. I've already died to myself. I've already been crucified with Christ. I'm not thinking about preservation. I'm thinking about obedience. I'm thinking about the kingdom. And it's not because I'm so rough and tough. We've already crossed that bridge. We've already died. I remember when we were caring for my mother-in-law, and she was a believer. And she had advanced Alzheimer's when she came to live with us. And she lived with us for 8 years. You know, probably after year 2, stopped talking altogether, was bedridden the last 3 years of the time that she was with us. My wife did a fantastic job of caregiving with her. But I once asked my wife, we were actually on our way to visit one of our church planters, and I asked her how she was doing as she anticipated her mother's passing. And she said, you know, actually, I'm doing quite fine. And I was curious about that response. she said, in a very real sense, my mom's been dead for a long time. And if you've ever been around an Alzheimer's situation, you would realize that's not a cruel thing to say. Her mind was gone. Almost all of her physicality was gone. We were caring for her and doing it in a loving way. But in one sense, she'd already died. And I think that's what we're talking about here. If you've already died, then death is not this block to doing the will of God, even if the will of God is scary. It's not a block.
It's a little bit like a soldier who goes to war, goes, I know I'm not going home. I'm going to die here.
Yeah, that's right.
And now I can be a lot braver.
Well, that's right.
And a lot more courageous.
Well, that's right, because you're not holding on.
Yeah.
You're not holding on. And we're not to be holding on. We're to be the people that actually believe that it is far better to depart and be with Christ. Now, again, that's counterintuitive. It's far better to die and be with Christ than to remain on. If we believe that, that would free us up to lay it all on the altar every single day, because we've already reckoned ourselves as dead.
I think I'm going to listen to that last 5 minutes every morning before I brush my teeth, because I can tell you,
well, I need to listen
struggle
to
there.
it. I need to listen to it too, Rob. I know the right answers, but that doesn't mean that's where I'm at in my emotions and in my heart. But I know it's right, and I want to be there as the Lord continues to move me along in my life.
A few minutes back, we were talking about leadership, and I want to touch on one more thing about leadership. And you were talking about elders and, a plurality. And I know you believe in that. But I've also heard people say, the first among equals. Because I think with leadership, it's not just about leading the congregation. The elders need a leader too. And I've experienced in several churches where the pastor is a bit afraid to stand up as a leader. I wondered if you just might talk about this idea of being equal yet still leading.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on there. One is a failure to make philosophical distinctions. It's kind of like in marriage. We hold to a complementarian view of marriage. So my wife Sue and I are, to use a philosophical term, we are ontologically equal. Before God, there is no difference. She doesn't go to God through me. She goes to God through Jesus Christ, just like me. But we're not functionally equal. You and I are Patriots fans. And,
yes, we are.
And we understood in the Brady era that all those players were equal in terms of their worth. Not financial worth, but in terms of that they contribute in their own way equally to the team. But they're not functionally equal. And that's where the salary differences come through. And they would have said that. An offensive lineman, even an all-star offensive lineman, would recognize that Tom Brady's function is more important than his and is specialized compared to his. And I think it's the same thing. An elder board, we are ontologically equal. Every elder gets one vote, and every elder has a right to make his case. But there's different roles, there's different functions. In marriage, the husband has a different function. And so I think that's one thing. We're just not making philosophical distinctions like that. I think, secondly, we have the problem of fundamental job security. Again, what happens if you lead and that produces tension on the leadership team? What do you do then? And so, again, there's kind of a conflict of interest, because if I push my leadership ideas and the rest of the group doesn't like it, I could end up being out of a job. And so there's probably some pacifying that's going on, maybe even some cowardice that's going on, because my job's on the line. And those two things, I think, produce an unhealthy environment. You need someone who's the lead pastor. He's the vision caster. We're in an anti-authority role, so all of that plays into it as well, Rob. You know that. But you've got to have someone that's doing the principal teaching, I think. You got to have somebody who's casting the vision. Now, the rest of the board is interacting with that. It's not like he has unilateral authority to just take the church in any direction he wants. But committees don't generate visions. The old adage that, a committee was assigned with designing a horse and out came a camel, because you gotta deal with everybody. Oh, you'd like a hump. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll put a hump on it. Well, it's not a horse anymore. But committees are great at vetting ideas. And so using them for the function that they're best suited for, and letting the lead guy, if he's truly a lead guy, do what lead guys do well. They cast vision. They see what's not necessarily visible to everybody's line of sight. And they say, I think we should go here, and I think we can go here. So now let's put our heads together. First of all, vet that idea, and then let's determine whether we can do that. How do we do that? Let's come up with a plan of attack. So I think those two things have really dumbed down the leadership. We all just want to be equal in an unnuanced way.
Yeah, I hear pastors stand up, and they're clearly the lead pastor, and they're the only one on the payroll, and they're like, hi, my name's so-and-so, and I'm one of the pastors here.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
What are we afraid of?
Yeah.
And there's
there, Rob, there's an attempt to be faithful to Scripture, but I think it's a non sequitur to say if there's a first among equals, somehow that violates the plurality of the eldership. I just think that doesn't necessarily follow. But I think they're trying to be carefully accurate regarding church polity according to the Scriptures. But it's unnecessary.
And we're going to dive into that much deeper down the road in another episode. I was just want to say, I think there's a practical component to this too. If you're the senior pastor and you're working on this all day, 5, 6, 7 days a week, and your elders are driving a backhoe, working as a mechanical engineer, as a firefighter, when they all come together, like, what have you been thinking about? Where are we going in this meeting?
Well,
there's just
right.
responsibilities.
Well, that's right.
For the guy on the payroll.
And and all the elders get that. And if some of them do tend to kind of lose their way, I remember having a conversation with an elder who was getting a little pushy with me. And I said, look, you are a specialist in this realm. I don't presume to know more about that or think more about that than you do. So at least appreciate, this is my day job. This is what I do. In fact, it's my life. So let's just start there and appreciate relative expertises without feeling like you can't push back against an idea. The lay elders, if I can use that terminology, which with some people that's even a no-no today, but the non-staff elders, they get that. They understand. You've been thinking about this. You've been dealing with this. You've been wrestling with this all day. So obviously we're going to allow what you have to say to carry more weight.
Yeah.
And they get that. And,
right.
And it makes a pastor's job appreciably easier.
Yeah, and that pastor's got to genuinely want the input. Like, I've been thinking about this all day, but I need some new perspectives.
Yeah.
Is this a good idea, a bad idea? Yeah. Guys, what do you think? That kind of thing.
That's right.
I want to talk about work ethic in a church planner. I'm not going to use the term workaholic. I don't think that's one of your favorites, but
it doesn't bother me.
All right. Well, when you're talking about work ethic, when it comes to a church planter or church revitalizer, what are you looking for? I mean, can this be done in 5 days a week? Anyway, I don't know. I'm just curious what your take on it is. Guys are different, but what does it take, Wes, to get this done?
Well, I think you could answer that question. I'll imitate the Lord Jesus. I'll answer a question with a question. Can you start a business from scratch 5 days a week? I don't know of anybody who says yes to that. I certainly don't know anybody who says yes to that and actually then does that. It's just the nature of starting anything. And if you look at any of the world's corporations or countries or even leisure activities, like if somebody wants to start a neighborhood or town football or soccer or little league program, whoever comes up with the idea is working beaucoup hours. Because when you start something, you're the only guy. And you could say, well, you got to learn to delegate. Well, you can't delegate until you first find out what the job even entails. And then you can't delegate unless you have people that are credible so you can delegate it to them. So it's not that simple. It's a great idea, but you just can't foist that on a new endeavor. So, no, I don't think so. Now, you can say, well, doesn't that put your family at risk? Doesn't that cause tension in the marriage? Well, you have to have your spouse with you, and then you have to be communicating so that you don't neglect in a way that harms. Now, that doesn't mean that it might still not look like neglect to somebody else. As I've said before, my kids were in all the activities in middle school and high school. They were like their parents, and they enjoyed sports, they enjoyed music, they did everything that they could. We didn't go to all those activities. And we told them up front, we're not going to be able to do that. We're planting a church, and this is our priority. But we love you. We're excited for those activities. We'll make as many as we can go to. Our kids were fine with that. They knew we loved them, but they also knew we were helping them develop their own lives. And we didn't want them to act or feel like if we weren't there, somehow it's not legitimate or somehow we don't care. And so I think that there's just there's a willingness to adapt the work ethic to the realities of your situation. I like to work. Some people like to work in the garden. Some people like to go play tennis. Other people like to, maybe watch or binge on a certain show. I'm not judging anybody. I like to work. And so that's kind of a leisure time activity for me. And if Sue says we got to, family's a little bit on tilt, I'd pull back and we'd make the adjustment. Or if she'd say, I'm feeling a little orphaned here, okay, I'll pull back and make whatever adjustment needs to happen. So I think each family has to decide, and each individual has to decide what needs to happen. It's kind of like, have you ever had somebody say, you've got to go on a date night? If you want to have a healthy marriage,
right, you
got to go on a date night.
Very popular.
I don't know how many people have said that to me in our 43 plus years of marriage. Guess what? We never go on a date night. I say to Sue, would you like to go on a date night? She's like, no. Now, part of it is she doesn't like spending money. But I'd like to just sit down and talk to you. And, I don't need all of the static of a date night. Let's just sit down, have a cup of coffee, and let's just talk here on the couch. Well, that works. So I think we just have to be careful to not come up with this uniform idea, well, you're a workaholic. Well, what do you base that on? Usually what they mean by that is you're neglecting something. You're so into your work that you're neglecting higher priorities. Maybe it's church, maybe it's your family, it's your marriage. Well, by that definition, I'm not a workaholic. But if you do it by hours, I clearly am a workaholic because that's what I do with my leisure time too. I like to work. It's fun. I was one of the privileged guys, Rob, that picked a career that he actually really enjoyed. I got paid for studying the Bible. And guess what? My wife has no problem with that at all because she knew if she called, I'd be there. She knew that she was my priority. And I'd drop whatever I was doing. Hey, guys, I'm going to have to get back to you on this. I got to find out what's going on here.
We're about out of time. I want to tell our listeners that we are about helping encourage and share some of your experiences with pastors out there. But unashamedly, we are also about recruiting for NETs, coming to Vermont and being part of our residency program, our internship. And I'm hearing you got to be a hardworking leader who's courageous, is going to go to seminary, wants to work hard, be an entrepreneur. That's a tall order. Do I have those things right?
Yeah, I think those things are right, but I would maybe soften the landing a little bit by saying there's a lot of people out there who are not necessarily gifted athletically that do well in sports. I think that we need to remember that the Spirit of God is a great gap filler. We bring an aspiration to God, and the Spirit of God enables us to do what we're trying to do. And I think that's part of the whole glory system because God has chosen to deposit this precious package of the gospel into earthenware vessels. Now, why has he done that? Because when it works, when the gospel does its saving work, nobody's confused about who should get the glory. Because, we're clay pots, as one person said. We would have never come up with this plan. Really? You're going to entrust it to these guys? but he did. And so anyone aspiring to go into the ministry needs to recognize that they can do all things through Christ who strengthens them, and not limit God because of whatever limitations they might see in themselves. God delights in showcasing the humble. That's what he's doing in salvation. And he wants to exalt the humble as we humbly come before him and say, Lord, use me however you will, and I am willing. And yes, I'm going to work hard. And when I'm afraid, I'm going to ask you to buoy me up so that I don't shrink back from my duty. My goodness, the Lord will be with you, and the Lord will strengthen you to do what you've set out to do.
So the number one attribute is desire.
I think so. I think the number one attribute is desire. And if you want to serve the Lord in this way, he takes all shapes and sizes. And it's clear from church history that he's blessed every conceivable type of person. The minister that ministered to me the most right after I got saved was a pastor. He ended up being the pastor that married us. He was terribly shy growing up, and he had a terrible stutter. And as he started to outgrow the stutter, he had a speech defect. He would not close off the consonants at the end of his words. So he'd say, you need to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. And he wouldn't get to the T. And he was embarrassed about that speech defect. But yet he felt like the Lord was calling him to ministry. And Rob, he was such a good teacher. And I would work the all-night shift when I was in college at the Holiday Inn. I was a night auditor. I'd go to church Sunday morning, and he'd preach from the New Testament. Then I'd come back Sunday evening, and he'd preach from the Old Testament. Speech defect and all. To this day, he's one of the best Bible teachers that I've ever heard, and was a huge stimulant to me in ultimately going into the pastorate. And he just gave his weakness, his imperfection, his foible to the Lord, and the Lord used him. He's blessed his church. He was a pastor of that church for over 40 years, and the church grew and the church flourished. And I went to that church the whole time I was at Ohio State. So I think that's an encouragement. All shapes, all sizes, whatever your perceived or real weaknesses are, if you believe that God wants you to serve and there's opportunity to do it, and you build the competencies to do it, which is going to take work, trust the Lord. He will bless your endeavor.
Well, I hope that really speaks to some people listening to this podcast, West. Well, that ends our time. Thank you for taking the time today, West. I thought this was a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to our next one already.
All right. Thanks, Rob. Good to talk to you.
To learn more about the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization's training and sending programs, visit us online at thenetcenter.org. For questions or comments, email us at pastorpastor@thenetcenter.org. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and consider sharing this episode with a friend. This podcast is a production of the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization. Nets, for the life of the church.